My name's Ethan. I'm 28 now, but this whole mess started back when I was 17, a skinny kid with a mop of dark hair and a chip on my shoulder the size of Texas. That was the year my folks decided I wasn't worth keeping around anymore. It's not something I ever thought I'd talk about, let alone write down, but lately I've been seeing other people share their stories online. Folks who've had their own run-ins with messed up families, and I figured maybe putting it all out there might help me make sense of it. Or at least help someone else who's stuck in a similar spot. So here it goes. Back then, I was a junior at Lincoln High in a small town called Millwood, about an hour outside of Pittsburgh. My dad, Frank, ran a little auto repair shop, and my mom, Diane, worked part-time at the library. We weren't rolling in money, but we had a decent house, a big backyard, and enough to get by. They had this whole roadmap laid out for me. Finish high school with straight A's, go to Penn State like my dad did for 2 years before he dropped out, get a business degree, and take over the shop one day. It was their dream, not mine, but they didn't care about that. The thing is, I wasn't cut out for school. I wasn't stupid. My grades were okay when I put in the effort, but sitting in a classroom all day made me feel like a caged animal. I'd been diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 12, but my parents acted like it was something I could just push through if I tried hard enough. To them, anything less than their plan was me being lazy or ungrateful. What I really loved was cars. Not just fixing them, but building them from scratch, tinkering with engines, making something run smoother than it ever had before. I'd spend hours in the garage with my dad's old tools, tearing apart junkers I'd bought for cheap and putting them back together. It was the only time I felt like I was worth a damn. My parents didn't see it that way. Every time I brought up maybe skipping college and going straight into mechanics, maybe even getting certified, they'd lose it. My mom would get this tight-lipped frown, like I'd just said I wanted to live in a cardboard box under a bridge. My dad would go off about how people like us don't waste our lives turning wrenches for a living, even though that's exactly what he did. I think it was about pride for them, bragging rights at the VFW or the church potlucks about their kid who made something of himself, not some grease monkey who never left Millwood. Things had been rocky for a while by the spring of my junior year. I'd been working after school at a gas station, pumping gas and doing basic repairs, saving every penny I could. My grades were slipping because I just couldn't muster the energy to care about algebra or history when I knew it wasn't what I wanted. Dinners at home turned into battlegrounds. They'd nag me about college applications, about how I was throwing away my future, about how I owed it to them to do better. I tried to explain that I had my own ideas, but they'd shut me down every time. The breaking point came in May, a few weeks before summer break. I'd been researching this mechanic certification program at a technical school in Pittsburgh. It was a 1-year course, affordable, and they had a job placement program at the end. I'd even put together a little portfolio of the cars I'd fixed up, and they'd accepted me with a small scholarship. I was proud of it. First time I'd ever felt like I'd earned something on my own. I decided to tell my parents about it over dinner, thinking maybe they'd see how serious I was. Big mistake. I can still picture it clear as day. We were sitting around the old oak table in the kitchen, eating meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I took a deep breath and said, I got into this mechanic program in Pittsburgh. It's what I want to do. I don't think college is for me. My dad's fork hit the plate so hard I thought it'd crack. My mom's eyes welled up like I'd just told her I was joining a cult. Then the yelling started. My dad called me a fool, said I was spitting on everything they'd worked for. My mom sobbed about how she'd failed as a mother, how she didn't know where they'd gone wrong. I tried to tell them why it mattered to me, how I felt alive when I was under a hood, how I could build a career out of it, but they wouldn't hear it. My dad cut me off with something I'll never forget. If you're too dumb to see what you're throwing away, then you're no son of mine. We didn't raise you to be a failure. That lit a fire in me. I shouted back that I was tired of living their life instead of mine, that I was almost 18 and could make my own damn decisions. It got ugly fast. We were all screaming, throwing words like grenades. I said things I regret, like how I hated them for trying to control me. They said worse, stuff that cut deeper than I'll ever admit. Finally, my dad pointed at the door and said, if you're not going to live by our rules, then get out. You're not welcome here. I think he thought I'd back down, apologize, and fall in line. But I was too mad, too hurt. I stormed upstairs, grabbed a duffel bag I'd kept packed in my closet, just in case, because I'd had a gut feeling things might go south, and shoved in some clothes, my laptop, and the $800 I'd saved from the gas station. I grabbed my birth certificate and social security card from a lockbox under my bed, thankful I'd had the sense to keep them handy. When I came downstairs with the bag over my shoulder, my parents were standing there, stunned. My mom started in with, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. You think you're so smart at 17, but you'll be back here begging us to take you in before the summer's out. She had this smug little twist to her mouth that made my blood boil. My dad didn't say a word, just opened the front door and stared at me with cold eyes. I walked out, and he slammed it behind me so hard the windows rattled. I stood on the front porch for a minute, the night air cool and heavy with the smell of rain. A storm was rolling in, and as the first drops hit my face, I thought, well, this is some real dramatic nonsense right here. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wasn't coming back. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Nate, whose family lived a few blocks away. His parents were good people, the kind who'd help you out without asking too many questions. When I told him what happened, he said, "Get over here. You can stay with us." That was the start of it. Me, 17, kicked out of my own house with nothing but a bag and a burning need to prove my parents wrong. Those first few days were a haze of anger and fear, but one thing kept me going. I was not going to let them be right. I'd figure it out, no matter what it took. After my folks kicked me out that rainy night in May, I walked the 3 blocks to Nate's house with my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, feeling the weight of it all, the bag, the fight, the whole damn situation. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through my hoodie, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, stuck on my mom's smug prediction that I'd be back begging in a month, and my dad's cold silence as he slammed the door. I kept thinking, no way. I'm not giving them the satisfaction. Nate's family lived in a modest split-level house on the edge of Millwood, the kind of place where the front yard was always cluttered with bikes and the porch light was left on for anyone who needed it. When I got there, Nate met me at the door, his shaggy blonde hair falling into his eyes. He didn't say much, just stepped aside and let me in. His mom, Linda, was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove that smelled like chicken soup. She took one look at me, dripping wet, face tight with anger, and didn't ask a single question. She just said, "Ethan, you're staying here as long as you need. Go put your stuff in the basement. There's a pull-out couch down there." That first night, I barely slept. The basement was cool and quiet, with a musty smell from old carpet and a faint hum from the furnace. I lay on that lumpy pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. I was 17, still in high school, and now I didn't have a home. Every so often, I'd get this wave of panic, like, holy crap, I'm on my own, and my chest would tighten up so bad I could hardly breathe. But then I'd think about my parents, about how sure they were that I'd fail, and that anger would kick in and pull me through. The next few days were a blur. Nate's parents didn't pry, but Linda sat me down the morning after I showed up and asked what my plan was. I told her about the mechanic program in Pittsburgh, how I'd been accepted and had a partial scholarship, and how I just needed to finish high school and figure out a way to make it work. She nodded, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and said, "We'll help you get on your feet, but you've got to keep going to school and keep working. You're welcome here, but it's not permanent." I appreciated that, no coddling, just straight talk. I was still enrolled at Lincoln High, with about a month left until graduation. Going to school every day was surreal. I'd sit in class, pretending everything was normal, while my mind spun with questions. Where was I going to live after Nate's? How was I going to pay for food, rent, the program? I'd duck into the bathroom between periods to splash water on my face, trying to shake off the exhaustion and the panic attacks that kept creeping up. My teachers didn't know what was going on, and I wasn't about to tell them. The last thing I needed was pity. I'd been working part-time at the gas station for almost a year, and I went to my boss, Mr. Hargrove, the day after I got kicked out. He was a gruff old guy with a gray mustache and a limp from a Vietnam War injury, but he'd always been fair to me. I told him I needed more hours, that I was in a bind and had to support myself now. He didn't ask for details, just looked at me for a long moment and said, "All right, kid. I can give you 30 hours a week. You're good with the pumps and the oil changes. Don't screw it up." That bumped me up from 15 hours, and it meant more money coming in, but it also meant I was juggling school and work like never before. A week after I left, my mom sent me a text. It wasn't an apology or even a check-in to see if I was alive. It just said, "When you're ready to come home and do things our way, the door's open." I stared at it for a good 5 minutes, my thumb hovering over the reply button, before I deleted it. A couple days later, my dad left a voicemail. "Ethan, you need to stop this nonsense and come back. We're willing to help you, but it's got to be on our terms." I didn't call him back either. They weren't sorry. They were just waiting for me to crack, to prove they were right. That lit a fire under me like nothing else. Graduation came around in June, and I walked across that stage with my head held high, even though I was still crashing in Nate's basement. My parents showed up. I saw them in the stands, dressed up like they were proud of me, but I didn't stick around to talk. I grabbed my diploma, hugged Nate and his mom, and got out of there. Seeing them sitting there, acting like nothing had happened, made my stomach turn. I wasn't ready to face them, not yet. By the end of June, I knew I couldn't stay at Nate's forever. His parents had been saints, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome. I'd saved up about $1,200 from the gas station, and I started looking for a place to live. Millwood didn't have much in the way of cheap housing, but I found a room for rent in a rundown house on the edge of town. It was owned by a guy named Carl, a retired truck driver who smoked like a chimney and didn't care who you were as long as the rent was on time. The house was a mess, peeling paint, creaky floors, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 80s, but the room was $300 a month, and I could swing it with my gas station money. I moved in with my duffel bag, a cheap air mattress I'd bought at Walmart, and a folding chair I'd found at a yard sale. The room was small, with a single window that looked out on a gravel alley, but it was mine. No one could tell me to leave, and that felt like freedom, even if it came with roaches and a leaky ceiling. I enrolled in the mechanic program that summer, using my scholarship and the rest of my savings to cover the first semester's tuition. Classes started in August, and I'd have to commute an hour each way to Pittsburgh on a Greyhound bus, but I was determined to make it work. Those first few months on my own were brutal. I was working 30 hours a week at the gas station, taking the bus to Pittsburgh 3 days a week for classes, and trying to keep my head above water. I ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches and instant noodles, and I lost weight because I couldn't afford much else. I'd see kids my age posting pictures online, college dorms, football games, family barbecues, and it hit me hard how different my life was. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd think about my mom's voice saying, "You'll be back begging in a month," and I'd grit my teeth and keep going. I wasn't going back. Not ever. Living in that rundown room in Carl's house was a far cry from the life I did back home, but it was mine, and that's what kept me going. It had been about 4 months since my folks kicked me out, and I was starting to get a handle on things, even if it didn't always feel like it. The mechanic program in Pittsburgh was kicking my butt, classes 3 days a week, plus homework and hands-on projects, but I loved it. For the first time, I was learning something I actually cared about, something I was good at. The instructors didn't treat me like a kid who couldn't focus. They saw I had a knack for engines and pushed me to get better. The commute was rough, though. I'd catch the Greyhound bus at 6 o'clock in the morning from Millwood, ride an hour to Pittsburgh, spend all day in class or the shop, then take the bus back, getting home around 8 o'clock at night. On workdays, I'd head straight from the bus station to the gas station, pulling shifts until midnight. Sleep was a luxury I didn't get much of, maybe 5 hours a night if I was lucky. My diet wasn't much better. Peanut butter on stale bread, ramen noodles, and whatever cheap snacks I could grab from the gas station when Mr. Hargrove wasn't looking. I dropped about 15 pounds that first summer, and I looked like a ghost half the time, pale and hollow-eyed. Carl's house wasn't exactly a palace. The room I rented had a mattress on the floor, a rickety folding chair, and a lamp I'd salvaged from the curb. The walls were thin, so I could hear Carl coughing up a lung from his smoking habit or arguing with his girlfriend through the phone at all hours. The bathroom was shared, and the shower would go from scalding hot to ice cold without warning, which made for some interesting mornings. But I paid my $300 rent on time every month, and Carl left me alone, which was all I asked for. My parents didn't let up, though. About a month after I moved into Carl's place, my dad showed up at the gas station one evening. I was under the hood of a beat-up Chevy, swapping out a fuel pump, when one of the other guys, Tommy, came over and said, "Some dude in a flannel shirt's asking for you up front." I wiped my hands on a rag and peeked out from the garage bay. There was my dad, standing by the counter, looking out of place in his clean jeans and button-up, like he didn't belong among the oil stains and tire racks. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to deal with him, so I ducked back into the garage and told Tommy to say I was busy. I watched from the window as my dad waited around for a bit, then finally got back in his truck and drove off. He didn't try again after that, but it left me rattled for days. Then there were the messages. My mom would text every couple of weeks, stuff like, "Ethan, we're worried about you. Come home and we can figure this out together." My dad left voicemails saying, "You're being stubborn. We're still here when you realize you can't make it on your own." They never asked how I was doing, never said they were sorry, just kept acting like I was the one who'd messed up and they were doing me a favor by offering to take me back. I stopped responding after a while, but every message stoked that fire in me to prove them wrong. Things started to shift around September, about 4 months after I'd left home. I'd been working at the gas station long enough that Mr. Hargrove trusted me with more than just pumping gas and changing oil. One day, a regular customer named Ray came in with his old Ford pickup. Ray was a big guy, maybe 40, with a thick beard and a handshake that could crush your bones. He did odd jobs around town, landscaping, snow plowing, whatever paid the bills, and his truck was always breaking down. This time, it was the alternator. I fixed it for him, but while I was under the hood, I noticed a bunch of other stuff that was about to go bad. Worn belts, a leaky radiator hose, some loose wiring. I pointed it all out to him, showed him how to fix it himself if he wanted, and even sketched a little diagram on a napkin so he'd remember. Ray was impressed. He came back a week later and asked if I'd ever thought about doing side work. "You've got a good head for this," he said. "I've got some buddies who could use help with their vehicles. Pays better than this place, and it's cash under the table." I jumped at the chance. The gas station paid minimum wage, and even with 30 hours a week, I was barely scraping by. Ray started sending me jobs, tune-ups, brake repairs, stuff like that, and I'd work on them in the parking lot of Carl's house or at the customer's place if they had a garage. It wasn't much at first, maybe $50 here, $100 there, but it added up. By November, I'd saved enough to move out of Carl's dump. Ray hooked me up with a guy named Javier, who was renting out a room in his apartment closer to the bus station. Javier was a cook at a diner in town, quiet but friendly, and the place was a step up, cleaner, with a working shower and a kitchen I could actually use. Rent was $400 a month, but with the side jobs and my gas station gig, I could manage it. Plus, it cut my commute time to Pittsburgh by 20 minutes, which was a godsend. Around that time, my parents changed their tune a bit. My mom sent a text saying, "We miss you, Ethan. We're willing to talk about your plans if you come home." My dad called and left a message. "We can find a compromise, but you've got to meet us halfway." It pissed me off all over again. After months of telling me I'd fail, now they wanted to act like they were reasonable? I didn't reply. I was too busy building something for myself, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back into their world. By the time I turned 18 in December, I'd finished my first semester of the mechanic program with decent grades. Turns out I wasn't too dumb to learn when it was something I cared about. Ray kept sending me more work, and I started building a little reputation around town as the kid who could fix anything with wheels. I moved into Javier's place, set up a real bed instead of an air mattress, and even bought a used dresser from a thrift store. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. The hardest part wasn't the money or the exhaustion, it was the loneliness. I'd see families at the gas station, parents picking up their kids from school, laughing and arguing like it was no big deal, and it had hit me that I didn't have that anymore. My parents had made it clear their love came with a price tag, and I wasn't willing to pay it. But I kept going, one day at a time, because every step forward was proof they'd been wrong about me. By the time I hit 19, I was starting to feel like I might actually make it. It had been a year and a half since my folks kicked me out, and while life wasn't easy, I was carving out something that felt like mine. The mechanic program in Pittsburgh was going strong. I'd finished my first year and was halfway through my second, picking up certifications along the way. I wasn't just learning how to fix cars anymore. I was learning how to diagnose problems, rebuild engines, and even work on some of the newer electric models coming out. It was tough, but it was the kind of tough I could handle, the kind that made me feel alive. I was still living with Javier in that apartment near the bus station. It wasn't fancy, just a two-bedroom place with mismatched furniture and a kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned on it. But it was home. Javier was a good roommate. He worked late shifts at the diner, so we didn't see each other much. But when we did, he'd share leftovers from work, and we'd talk about nothing important over a couple of beers. It was the closest thing I had to a normal life, and I clung to it. Work was keeping me busy. I'd cut back to 20 hours a week at the gas station because the side jobs Ray sent my way were picking up. I'd built a decent little network around Millwood, guys who needed their trucks fixed, moms who couldn't afford the dealership for their minivans, even a few old-timers who just wanted someone to tinker with their classic cars. I'd work in Javier's driveway or borrow space from Ray's garage when the weather got bad. The money was good cash, no taxes, and more than I'd ever made pumping gas. I started saving up, not just for rent and tuition, but for something bigger I couldn't quite name yet. My parents hadn't given up trying to pull me back in. Around my 19th birthday, my mom showed up at the apartment unannounced. I'd just gotten home from a long day, classes in Pittsburgh, then a break job for a guy in town, and I was dead tired, sitting on the couch with a plate of leftover spaghetti. The knock on the door startled me. When I opened it and saw her standing there, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked worn out, her hair grayer than I remembered, her eyes tired. She stepped inside without asking, looking around the place like she was inspecting it for flaws. She started with small talk. How was I? What was I up to? How was the apartment? Then got to the point. Your dad's been having a rough time at the shop, she said. Business is slow, and we're struggling to keep up with bills. We thought maybe you could help out a little. I couldn't believe it. After everything, kicking me out, telling me I'd fail, barely talking to me unless they needed something, now they wanted my money? I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous I didn't know what else to do. I told her I was still getting on my feet, that I didn't have anything to spare. She left with a tight smile, like I'd let her down, but she didn't push it. Not that time. That visit messed me up for a while. I started second-guessing myself. Was I being too hard on them? Were they really in trouble, and was it my job to help? But then I'd remember the night they threw me out, my mom's certainty I'd come crawling back, my dad's cold dismissal, and I'd get mad all over again. Javier noticed I was off and asked what was going on. I told him the whole story, everything from the fight to the latest visit, and he just shook his head. Man, that's rough. But you don't owe them nothing. They made their choice. He was right, but it didn't make the feelings go away. To deal with it, I threw myself into work and school. By the spring of my second year in the program, I'd earned my first full certification in automotive repair. Ray started giving me bigger jobs, engine overhauls, transmission work, and the money got better. I moved out of Javier's place and into a small studio apartment of my own. It was nothing special, a single room with a tiny kitchenette and a bathroom so small you could barely turn around, but it was all mine. I bought a used couch, a real bed, and a TV from a thrift store, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something real. Around that time, I met Sarah. She was a cashier at the diner where Javier worked, and I'd see her sometimes when I'd stop by to grab food after a late job. She was short, with curly red hair and a quick smile, and she had this way of talking that cut through the noise, sharp, funny, no filter. One night, I was there eating a burger, and she slid into the booth across from me during her break. You're Ethan, right? Javier's buddy? He says you're some kind of car wizard. We got to talking, and it was easy, natural. She'd grown up in a trailer park outside of town, raised by a single mom who worked 2 jobs, so she got what it was like to hustle. We started hanging out more, grabbing coffee or catching a movie when I wasn't working. I told her about my family, about how they'd kicked me out and how I was trying to make it on my own. She didn't flinch or give me that pity look I hated. Instead, she told me about her mom, who'd pushed her to go to college even though they couldn't afford it, and how she dropped out after a semester because it wasn't for her. Sometimes you've got to make your own path, she said. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's yours. Sarah became my rock. We weren't dating yet, just friends, but having her around made the loneliness less sharp. Meanwhile, my parents kept reaching out, their messages getting more desperate. My dad's shop was losing customers to a big chain garage that had opened up in town, and they were dipping into savings to stay afloat. My mom started calling more often, leaving voicemails about how family should stick together, how they needed me. I ignored most of them, but it was getting harder to tune out. By 20, I'd finished the mechanic program with a full set of certifications. Ray offered me a steady gig working with him, not just side jobs, but real work with regular hours and benefits. He was expanding his business, taking on more clients, and he needed someone reliable. It was a big deal, a vote of confidence I hadn't expected, and it meant more to me than anything my parents could have said. I took the job, quit the gas station, and started making decent money, enough to pay my bills, put some away, and even start thinking about the future. My parents found out about my new gig somehow, probably through the Millwood grapevine, and suddenly they were all over me again. They'd call, text, even show up at Ray's garage when I was working. My mom would say things like, "We're so proud of you, Ethan, but we need your help now." My dad would hint at needing a loan, never asking outright but making it clear they were in deep. I kept them at arm's length, telling them I'd think about it, but inside I was boiling. They'd spent years telling me I'd never amount to anything, and now that I was doing all right, they wanted a piece of it. I was building a life, work I loved, a place of my own, a friend like Sarah who got me. It wasn't what my parents had planned, but it was better, and I wasn't about to let them tear it down.